Okay, so as I said, good morning, Hofstra. Welcome to our first installment of In Conversation for Fall 2020. My name is Dr. Jonathan Lightfoot. I am the director of the Hofstra Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice. We were established in January 2017. Part of our mission is to promote diversity, inclusiveness, and cultural awareness on campus by featuring several distinctive research and scholarly programs throughout the academic year. In Conversation at the Center for Race is a featured program of roundtable discussions around everyday issues that involve race and social justice and that directly impact the Hofstra community. The aim is to create a space for conversation and to bridge the gap between staff, students, faculty, and administrators of all ranks, giving an equal voice to everyone. In Conversation at the Center for Race will take place 3 times per semester during Common Hour on the second Wednesday of the month. This In Conversation series is on disability rights activism. It'll be facilitated by Craig Rustici from the English Department and Disability Studies Program and Andrea Nerlich from Rehabilitation Counseling Program at Hofstra. We have speakers today. Our distinguished guest speakers are Kevin Berry from Quinnipiac University, Mark Drummer from PUSH, which is the People United in Support of the Handicapped, and James Weisman, the president and CEO of the United Spinal Organization. And now I'm going to thank all those who've participated in making this program happen. We have our former Associate Director at the Center for Race, Dr. Benita San Pedro, and our current Associate Director, Dr. Veronica Lippincott. Finally, I'd like to thank our Provost, Dr. Herman Berliner, and Vice Provost, Dr. Maggie Abraham, whose valuable leadership helps the university centers to make Hofstra a more diverse, inclusive, and engaging campus community. I'd just like to invite you also next Wednesday, September 16th, when we explore the ABCs of the school to prison pipeline, and again on Wednesday, September 23rd, when we discover the interesting work being done around the Innocence Project. And these events are being co-sponsored with another center, the Center for Civic Engagement. And so I'm going to turn it over to my Associate Director now, Dr. Veronica Lippincott. Thank you.
Good morning. It's such a pleasure to see all of you this morning. I'd first like to introduce the facilitators of our discussion today. Dr. Andrea Nerlich is an associate professor and graduate director of the Rehabilitation Counseling Program here at Hofstra. She teaches courses for students in rehabilitation counseling and mental health counseling related to psychosocial response to disability, assessment, transition services, and career development. She serves on board of directors of the Vocational Education and Work Adjustment Association and the Rehabilitation Counselors and Vocational Evaluation and Work Adjustment Association and the Rehabilitation Counselors of Education Association, and is the editor of both associations' journals. She was recently recognized as the Rehabilitation Educator of the Year by the National Council on Rehabilitation Education, and in 2017, was inducted into the inaugural 40 Under 40 class in her alma mater, Springfield College. Her passions and research interests include transition services for students with disabilities, ecological assessment and vocational evaluation, collaboration models, social justice and advocacy, and student and professional development and identity. Our second facilitator, Dr. Craig Rustiki, is Professor of English and Director of Disability Studies at Hofstra University. Trained as a literary scholar, he has published on early modern British literature, including a book on the Pope Joan legend concerning a medieval woman who allegedly cross-dressed her way into the papacy. In recent years, Dr. Rustiki, who is legally blind from birth, has begun teaching and writing on disability studies. His current projects concern ocular centrism in H.G. Wells' short story, The Country of the Blind, and the rule of normalcy in Kurt Vonnegut's dystopian tale, Harrison Bergeron. I want to thank you both for organizing and facilitating this esteemed panel.
All right, is that our cue to take it away? All right, thank you so much, Jonathan and Veronica. So this year we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a landmark civil rights legislation for people with disabilities. So today we've assembled our panel to give insight into the disability rights movement for the time periods before, during, and after this legislative movement. Each of the members of our panel have been an activist and advocate for disability rights and inclusion. We are excited to learn about this history from them, but also their thoughts on the future of disability justice within our country. First, a couple of housekeeping items. If you want to be able to see and highlight who's speaking, you can change your Zoom view to speaker view, and that will highlight the person who's speaking. If you are not speaking, aside from the three panelists, we please ask that you mute your microphones just to decrease any background noise. If you have any questions or comments, they can be added at any time to the chat function, and we're going to be addressing those at the end of the session. If you are a student in a class for which you are going to get credit and or extra credit for your attendance today, at the end of the session, I'll be putting a link in the chat where you can submit your attendance, and that will be given to your instructor. If you are a professional rehabilitation counselor and are seeking continuing education credits for this, I will also put a link in the chat at the end so that you can complete the evaluation for the session, and those will be emailed to you. I want to give a moment of space right now for one of the editors of the Hofstra Chronicle, who has a short announcement. Andrea Forbes, if you would like to make your announcement.
Thank you, Dr. Nerlich. My name is Ajane Forbes. I'm an editor at the Hofstra Chronicle, and I'm writing an article about this panel discussion today. So anyone who will be willing to give their opinion or give some insight about what they think was interesting about the panel discussion, if you would like to drop your email below, or I can drop mine and you can contact me, whichever works for you, that would be great. Thank you, Dr. Nerlich.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much. So I'd like to first introduce each of our speakers. And as I mentioned, they will each be, even though some of them lived through more of these eras than they'll be discussing, each one of the panelists will be situating their discussion of the disability rights movement to certain points in time. So our first panelist is Mark Drummer, who will be providing insight into pre-ADA history. Mark is a two-time alumnus of Hofstra, receiving his BA in 1972 and his Master of Arts in 1975. While at Hofstra, he was a member and officer of PUSH, People United in Support of the Handicapped, and was the founder of Hofstra's Rolling Dutchman wheelchair basketball team. He also served as a member of the President's Committee on Employment of the Handicapped and lobbied for the signing of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Following Hofstra, Mark worked as a clinical microbiologist at both the A. Holly Patterson Home and Nassau University Medical Center, with a specialty in tuberculosis. He retired in 2006. Personally, he is a former coach of the Long Island Lightning Junior Wheelchair Basketball Team, a program for youth ages 5 through high school. He is a proud husband, father, and grandfather of 2 grandchildren. James Weisman is going to be representing more of the ADA era. Jim was general counsel for the United Spinal Association for over 40 years and became president and chief executive officer in July 2015. Jim is a recognized expert on disability rights. He's led efforts on public transit and taxicab accessibility in New York City and other major cities. He was a key negotiator with Congress in drafting and achieving the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and authored transportation provisions in the law. In July 1995, Jim became a founding member of the American Association of People with Disabilities Board of Directors, and in 2003 was elected board chair. He earned his law degree from Seton Hall University Law School, we won't hold that against him, and is routinely consulted by disabled people, advocates, attorneys, employers, and transit operators who wish to employ or provide services to people with disabilities. Lastly, representing our post-ADA or the ADAAA era is Kevin Barry. Kevin is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Law at Quinnipiac University School of Law. He teaches administrative law and disability law and is the co-director of the law school's Civil Justice Clinic, which represents low-income clients through a combination of direct legal services and policy advocacy. Prior to joining Quinnipiac, Kevin was a teaching fellow in Georgetown University's Law Center's Federal Legislation Clinic, where he represented a national coalition of disability rights organizations in support of their efforts to amend the Americans with Disabilities Act. He was also a member of the team of disability rights lawyers that successfully negotiated draft legislation language with lawyers from the business community, resulting in the passage of the ADA Amendments Act of 2008. We are very excited about our esteemed panelists, and I will turn it over to my partner, Dr. Rustiki, to ask our first question of our panelists.
Thank you, Andrea. I just want to share in all the thank yous that have already been offered for organizers and panelists. So for our first question, government recognition and protection of the rights of people with disabilities has advanced in phases, marked by the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, 2008 ADA Amendments Act, and even the 2010 Affordable Care Act. Grassroots activism contributed to each of these legislative advances. We invite our presenters to help us understand the experiences and emotions of people with disabilities and disability activists during each of these moments. So let's start with Mark, and then we'll follow with Jim addressing the 80s and 90s, and Kevin this millennium. Please tell us about your experiences as a disability rights activist in the 60s and 70s.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks again for organizing it. And I appreciate all the panelists being here, and as well as whoever else is listening. So let me begin by saying I was a victim of polio in 1954. So I've lived through pre-ADA more of my life than post-ADA. So let's assume I was that we're going back in time, and I'm telling you about the fact that I was in the hospital with polio back in 1954 and 5. I would have been in kindergarten that year, missed it. But they did allow me to have a modicum of education in there, K through 8, one classroom taught by a nun. And that was beneficial. I learned something, but you know, I missed all that socialization that I would have gotten in kindergarten. Once that was finished and I was back home, my parents went to sign me up for the local elementary school, and were told, no, he's got a disability, he can't go there. So they petitioned the Board of Education, and thankfully they had a friend who was on the board who acted in my behalf, and they allowed me to attend the local elementary school. So in order for that to happen, my mother had to sign a statement that if I needed to use the restroom during the day, she would come to the school and help me. And without that signature, they weren't having it. And be damned if I got educated or not. Back in, so that was signed. Eventually, I was able to befriend one of the kind custodians in the school, and he was able to help me if I needed to use the restroom during the day. However, they also had to sign for their transportation, because they couldn't put me on a regular school bus. They had to hire a taxi, as it were, and my mother had to sign a form saying she would meet me at the bus, at the taxi, at my house, and at the school, and at the taxi when I was done with school every day. So there were restrictions put on my attendance at school in order to get an education. At one point during my elementary education, I was assigned a book report, one of the first book reports I had ever done. And so my mother asked me, give me an idea what kind of books you like to read. So I did. And she went into the library, which was up a long flight of steps. And she gathered an armful of books on that particular subject and walked out of the library. And they screamed at her and were following her all the way down the stairs. Where you going with those books, ma'am? You didn't check any of them out. And my mother turned to them and said, he didn't choose which one he wants yet. And they said, well, you can't walk out of here with them. And a fight ensued verbally. And so my mother won the fight, and I got to choose my book, and she continued her activism on my behalf. And within, I'd say 3 or 4 years after that, there was a ramp going up those that staircase, allowing access to that public library for all the public. So let's see. While I was a youngster, I attended Camp Corolla during the summer. I don't know, probably nobody's ever heard of it here, but it was a camp specifically for the disabled. So it was the first time in my life that I was able to interact with other people with disabilities on a large scale, essentially telling me mentally that I'm competing with them on an equal playing field. And that was instrumental to my thinking all the way down the line. Would have been better if it was not a segregated camp, I think, but that didn't exist. So that happened. When it came time for me to enter religious school, the religious school was down a whole flight of stairs in the basement of the building, and they made no accommodations to get me in. And my parents just said, we got enough fights going on. So that was tabled. So I was effectively physically denied a religious education. I was able to be tutored, home tutored for 1 year prior to my bar mitzvah, and learn whatever I could in that 1 year. But I'm clearly deficient in that knowledge for a reason. Cub Scouts. Everybody wants to have their kid join a Cub Scout den, or at least they did in those days. And my mom was told, we're not admitting him to an existing Cub Scout den. If you want him in the Cub Scouts, you have to start your own den. So she did. She recruited kids to join our Cub Scout den. And we went into the basement of our house, down a flight of stairs, naturally, and had our Cub Scout meetings, and that lasted for several years, and that was a good experience. My brother, my younger brother, we lived across the street from a Catholic church, and they had participated in the local Little League, and my brother was playing for the local Little League, and the coach was kind enough to ask me to be their scorer. And so that began my sports education. So I was able to help out with my brother's team. Excuse me. And they were really good about including me, unlike most other programs. So when they went to an event, they made sure I got to that event as well. So between them and my parents shuttling back and forth, that was a very positive thing in my life. When it came time to graduate elementary school, the local junior high school was accessible, but the local senior high school where we lived was not. And so the Department of Education decided, the Board of Ed decided that they would allow me to go to the senior high school, which was in a neighboring district, same town, neighboring district, school district. But unlike every other kid in 6th grade, I had to be interviewed by the administration of that high school to make sure I had the wherewithal in order to succeed in junior high and then later in high school. No other kid had to go through an interview with 3 administrators, just me. I wonder what it was. So I was able to proceed to the junior senior high school. Apparently they felt I was able enough to do that. And, but I did so. All the classmates that I had from elementary school were going to the other junior high school. So I was again socially isolated in terms of growing up with a group of same children. So while in high school, I did well enough to manage to get a membership in the Honor Society, and was interested in learning how to shoot a rifle. That was a thing back then, not so much now. And the local police boys club was willing to allow me, wait, let me rephrase that, was willing to allow my mother to drag me down the flight of stairs to the rifle range in the basement of their building in order to teach me how to shoot a rifle. I actually was fairly good at it and had a NRA certification to allow me to compete at the junior varsity and the following year, the varsity rifle team at my high school. That's, I would say, probably highly unusual. And I actually lettered with the rifle team in high school. I don't know if anybody knows what lettered means, but so that was, while it was an accomplishment for me, I think it was more important that it was an accomplishment for everybody else around me who saw me compete. So I think that was really the key as I began a role model. Now, when I was in 7th grade, Mom took me and a couple of friends over to the local movie house, and we went to go see a movie. So we're waiting online on this Saturday, and everybody's getting tickets, and they come up to me, and I hand the guy the money, and he says, "I'm sorry, we can't let you in." I said, "What do you mean you can't let me in? I'm here with all my friends. You let everybody else in." "No, sir, we can't let you in. You're a fire hazard." So that insulted me, you might imagine. And I complained bitterly, but there was not much I could do. And I started telling the people online buying tickets that, hey, these people don't want to let me in because I'm a fire hazard. And people were getting a little upset. And so eventually my mother said, let's just get out of here and go home. The next day in school, or the next week in school, I mentioned it in my art class, and the art teacher said, let's make a project. Let's help Mark picket the movie theater, and we'll all make picket signs. I said, that's a good idea. So they did, we did, and we showed up in force the following Saturday, and they had the cops there to corral us, and they ordered us off the sidewalk. It says the parking lot is the only public property you can walk on. And so we marched around the parking lot, stopping cars, stopping people trying to get into the theater. It was quite the scene, with the manager screaming from the sidewalk at us to get out of here, you're ruining my business. And eventually the police brokered a meeting between the movie theater owner and myself and my mother and the mayor of the town. And at that meeting, it was decided in my favor that, in fact, the theater was a fire hazard and my being there was not safe. And so they would allow me to come to the theater, but only during the week, not on weekends when there may be a lot of people there. That was the governmental decision at the time. No lawsuit because there's no ADA. 1964 World's Fair, the Ford Pavilion. You get into one of these brand new Fords and bingo, you're off. Sorry, no problem, but we're not letting you in on this ride. So, and then here's a really interesting story that tells all about what society thinks about us. We were driving down to Florida for vacation with my family. And my father arranged for a hotel in North Carolina. We got there late in the evening, and my father goes up to the desk at the hotel and he says, we made a reservation for a first floor room. He says, what's the name? Gives him the name. And the guy says, we don't have a reservation in that name. And my father says, I made it on this date. I made it. I gave you assurances. You sent me back a letter saying we're all good to go. And the guy says, well, let me see. And he goes through his file and he pulls out a card. Oh yes, we have the reservation right here, but it's canceled. My father says, well, who canceled it? And the desk clerk says, well, take a look right here. It says invalid. Because my father asked for a first floor room. So the reservation was canceled because I was invalid. So when I was applying for Hofstra, by the way, when I was applying for college as a graduate of high school, there's clearly 3 universities in the world that would even talk to somebody in a wheelchair. Hofstra, thankfully, was one of them, and I was local, so that's where I went. And curiously enough, I was interviewed by the Dean of Students in charge of the program for the higher education of the disabled. And we hit it off. We had a good relationship. And one of the first semester I had 5 classes at Hofstra. 4 of them were not accessible. So I had a choice. I could either wait by the door for someone strong looking to come along and drag me up those stairs, or I could just quit and go home. So I chose to make sure that I got to every class early enough so that people were there to give me a hand up those stairs. By the time I left, all classes were scheduled in accessible buildings, but that wasn't only my doing. So I yanked a person on crutches out of a telephone booth, and he had a connection to somebody else. And together, the 3 of us founded the Rolling Dutchman. That's the Hofstra University wheelchair basketball team that existed back then. We were the 2nd university-based wheelchair basketball team in the country. And for, I think it was 2 years, we played as a varsity team. And I lettered in wheelchair basketball at Hofstra, which is probably unique. And that started, I also was trying out for the rifle team there, and I eventually had a choice of either the rifle team or the basketball team. And I guess I chose the basketball team, which influenced the rest of my life greatly. We, as a team, the Rolling Dutchman, performed a lot of charity events. We played annually the Flying Dutchman. That would be the the non-wheelchair basketball team that represented the university. And that was a sellout crowd at every year when we ran that event. We put them in wheelchairs and we played against them. So it was a unique thing. We raised money. They put in curb cuts, including the electric doors on the north side of the original Unispan were due to us. We also had, really quick, with PUSH, we organized sensitivity training for all the administrators, where for me, since I was a person in a wheelchair, I provided a wheelchair for an administrator. We went around the campus all day long, went through what would have been my day, and made them completely aware of the difficulties, and that resulted in a lot of changes led by the administration. By the time I left the university with my master's degree, I was at the board meeting where they approved allowing disabled people to live in the dorms. That was a tremendous achievement. So let's see if I go through that. I was told by this same dean that interviewed me to get into Hofstra, by the way, when I went to him after the first semester with only 1 accessible class, I said to him, can we move some of these classes on my schedule to accessible rooms? And what he told me was, no, you're not going to have that advantage in the rest of your life, so why should we provide it to you now? Well, it turns out that I knew the editor of the Chronicle at the time, and they did a giant story on that, and he got fired. So I don't list that as an accomplishment, but in a sense, we removed another obstacle. So I did get to lobby with the with PUSH for the Rehab Act of '73, and that was an interesting experience, learning about how to walk around the halls of Congress, and we were able to. I mean, we weren't able to get it done. That was a nationwide effort led by many others. I was just a very tiny cog in that machine. But the fact that we got it done gave us some legal standing, which essentially allowed us to claim the right to live on campus. So there are many others, other items here that I have. I know I'm running short of time, so I guess if we're done with time, I can come back to this if there's time at the end, if you wish. So thank you, Andrea, Veronica, Craig, appreciate, and Kevin. Appreciate the chance to run some history by you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Looking forward to hearing more. Jim, could you speak to experiences of disability and disability activism in the 80s and 90s, the time that's leading up to the ADA.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Weissman. I'm president and CEO of the United Spinal Association, and I've been involved in disability rights as a lawyer since '77, but I worked at the Human Resources Center, which is now the Viscardi Center, when I was a teenager, and which was 67 through 69. And I met people with disabilities who were my own age, and became my friends, and disability was debunked immediately when you're a kid and you're having a great time with people with disabilities. Like they're your friends, you don't think much about anything else except that they're your friends. When I went to law school and still had disabled friends, it made sense to me to get involved in disability rights. I ran into Hofstra graduate Paul Hearn on the street in Manhattan in '77, osteogenesis imperfecta dwarf who had gone to law school and graduated a year before me. And it was exactly the day that the newspaper had the Rehabilitation Act regulations being signed by Secretary Califano from HEW, being reported in the newspaper. And I said to Paul, hey, congratulations. And he said, for what? And I said, Califano signed the reg. And he said, it's just a piece of paper. It's a lifetime of work ahead of everybody to do, you know. And boy, was that right. He and I then worked together for Legal Services Corporation as new lawyers doing property law for people with disabilities. We figured we would do landlord-tenant domestic relations, that kind of thing, and welfare and Social Security, which we did, but in came all the institutional discrimination. I can't get housing, education, employment, transportation, every life institution and every life domain discriminated. I met a woman named Frida Zames, who was a post-polio professor at Newark College of Engineering. And she wanted me to go in September '77 to a hearing of the MTA in New York City, where the board of directors ignored people with disabilities. They got up to testify and said they wanted lifts on buses. And the board got up and got coffee and talked to each other as if those people were not in the room. And then when they finished testifying, the meeting went back to normal with appropriate behavior from the board of directors. It got under my skin that night. It stayed under my skin. And in September '79, I went to Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association with a short stint at the governor's office between legal services and Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association. And we sued New York City Transit in September '79. I was 28. I didn't know what a big undertaking it would be. We eventually got a law firm to help me. We were a fly in the ointment at first. MTA made arguments, which I'm using this as an example of '70s activism, galvanizing people with disabilities, organizing people with disabilities, and the political and media response to people with disabilities asserting themselves. Blind people who were using transportation already in New York City were so offended by the way our litigation was reported and politicians' response to it, that they got involved with people with disabilities who couldn't use transportation because of their disabilities, because they felt like it was a statement about the worth of accommodating people with disabilities, and it was outrageous. Koch, who was considered at that time a liberal Democrat, was mayor of New York City. He opposed accessible transportation. So did the Permanent Citizens Advisory Committee to the MTA, which is an outrage. Citizens denying other citizens access. New York Times, every editorial board on every publication in New York City opposed us, and every politician but one in New York City opposed us. There was a city council person named Ruth Messenger who went on to be borough president and then ran against Giuliani and lost for mayor. She supported us. Alan Hevesy in the New York State Assembly has supported us. Other than that, that was it. There was a couple of disabled elected officials who were mildly supportive. But the New York State Human Rights Law prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability. And it applied to the MTA. And it also required you to build buildings accessibly, which included transportation stations and terminals, or at least we argued it did. And the Public Buildings Law of New York State said it did. If you buy buses, you're acting already. If you renovate stations, you're acting already. We argued the acts itself have to be non-discriminatory, the acts themselves. You can't just purchase a bus in a discriminatory way, i.e. an inaccessible bus. You can't just renovate a station in an inaccessible manner. You have to renovate it so everyone can use it, or the human rights law means nothing. You can't refuse, withhold from, deny the privileges of a place of public accommodation on the basis of disability. But it was happening in a wholesale way in New York State, and 30 other states by the time ADA rolled around, 30 plus states had some kind of non-discrimination law, but non-discrimination didn't mean anything to anybody. The milk of human kindness was unnecessary patronization, special things for people with disabilities, not inclusion. And so unnecessary discrimination guised as kindness was usually the motivation, to say nothing of low expectations of people with disabilities, for the discrimination. The New York Times actually wrote an editorial with the phrase in it, "There's a wheelchair on the tracks." It's just when we got an injunction to stop subway station renovation. Cuomo ran against Koch in '82 for the gubernatorial Democratic primary. Koch was opposing accessible transit. Cuomo was lieutenant governor. We had met him because they give the lieutenant governor nothing to do. So he had to be the International Year of the Disabled, the delegate from New York. He met with us a lot. He liked our arguments. We loved him. He ran against Koch. He said, if I'm elected, I'll settle the transit thing and make it accessible. It says he did. I mean, it took a year after he was elected to get this negotiated. But when he did it, key stations was all that the most right-thinking Democrats would agree to. A few stations. Right now, there's 100 of 466, about 110 of 466. I thought by now, after 50 years of 45 years of kids being mainstreamed into the public school system and sitting next to their able-bodied peers who vote and run for office, that every station would be accessible. So when we cooked key stations, we thought it was getting a toe in the water. We thought it was a floor, not a ceiling. Nobody would agree to do all stations. We got lifts on buses. They told us they'd only put lifts on half and we'd agree to it, but they told us, the lawyers, they need to give the MTA board members a victory on something and they'll never buy another inaccessible bus, and they never have. But if you read the agreement, it only says 50%. And then paratransit for those that couldn't use it, creating the nightmare that is called Access-a-Ride in New York City. We did a little better job in Philadelphia when we sued them in the late 80s. With transit, it was same organizing, galvanizing thing, people with disabilities. In New York, we formed an organization called Mobility Through Access. Same initials as MTA, I thought that was cute. And it meant we don't want just mobility. Don't give me this paratransit nonsense that's never gonna come, gonna cost a fortune, require duplicate fuel, vehicles, drivers, liability exposure. We want to be on the mainstream line system. But they said, no, you need mobility. It's not humane to wait for the bus in the rain. We'll pick you up at your door. Some people with disabilities bought this. Some parents of disabled kids thought this was a good idea because they were still protecting their kid. And we said, no, we do want mobility, but we want it through access, not special service. When the ADA was being discussed, I mean, there were things happening, right? All these kids had been mainstreamed. There were state laws about discrimination. There was 504 lawsuits all over the country. In 1988, we had beaten Philadelphia and New York City on transit. Believe it or not, lifts on buses were still controversial. The head of the Transportation Committee, a guy named Bud Schuster in the House, opposed lifts on buses. His mother was a wheelchair user, and he used to hold his hands up like this. See these knuckles? I've smashed them on doorways, pushing my mother's wheelchair through the door, and I'm not making transportation accessible. I wouldn't put my mother on there. In New York City, putting people on transit was a thing, putting. Not letting them go, but putting. And that was always the way it was discussed. We were at a hearing in New York, and Carol Bellamy, who was a city council president, a very liberal politician, was on the MTA board, as was the chairman of the Liberal Party, Stephen Berger, both big opponents of accessibility. And I got up to testify for Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association, United Spinal's predecessor. And they said, James Weisman, United Spinal Association. And she said, you're not a member of the Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association, are you? And one of the disabled people in the back of the room yelled something out. And he yelled out, what's the matter? We can't hire lawyers? And she said, foolishly, if you'd speak up, if you'd stand up, I could hear you. But I can't hear you unless you stand up. And he said, if I could stand up, he screamed, if I could stand up, if we could stand up, none of us would be here. And people were laughing and applauding, and she felt foolish, but no one was cowed. They really weren't. People argued the rationality of disability-related discrimination all the time, instead of denying it. We had a case against the City of New York Human Resources Administration. They were transferring all blind transcribing typists. They'd listen to fair hearings on headphones and fill out forms by clicking the typewriter to the number of spaces they knew where to fill in the information. I got it. And when we got into walking up to the council table, the judge said, what is this, a welfare case? Because the name of the case was against the HRA in New York City. And I said, no, Your Honor, it's not even on the record, we're just walking up. And I said, no, Your Honor, the city is proposing to transfer people just because they're blind. And he said, the judge said to the city's lawyer, well, you don't transfer people just because they're blind. What's the reason? And he goes, well, Your Honor, because they're blind. He goes, hold it, I told you not to say that. Don't start your answer with because they're blind, because you're pleading a violation of the statute. You're admitting a violation of the statute. And he continued with because they're blind, arguing the rationality of the discrimination and saying that they're employing them anyway. MTA argued that, and it's in their papers to dismiss our case, that they don't throw people off the train for being disabled. They don't post the signs that say no disabled, and they allow people to crawl if they want to, up and down the stairs. This was non-discriminatory behavior. This was even-handed treatment. Everybody's confronted with stairs. They argued that the public buildings law that requires you to make transportation stations and terminals accessible when you renovate or build new ones in New York State doesn't require subway to be accessible, because it also says buildings likely to be used by the handicapped, which was the term they used then. And they argued buildings likely to be used by the handicapped, including transportation stations and terminals, didn't mean the New York City subway, because it's not likely to be used because it's all steps. We told the judge that was pretty circular reasoning, that nothing would ever change. And this law was about change, and he let our case stand. And in fact, that whole subway case was settled on the basis of that, not the human rights law, which requires non-discrimination. When the two cases in Philly and New York were decided, we had to get them grandfathered into the ADA, because New York City and Philadelphia would have helped Chicago and Boston, the other two old rail cities. Cleveland had a little old rail system too, but the other two substantial old rail cities hadn't done anything yet. And Philadelphia and New York had agreed to do at least key stations, lifts on buses and paratransit. So essentially, the way the act was drafted was to make the provisions include the settlement agreements in New York and Philadelphia, so that the congressmen, everybody was Democrats, New York, Philly, Boston, Chicago, the congressmen from New York and Philadelphia didn't help Boston and Chicago. Although, if you read the ADA, it gives 30 years for heavy rail, and that was to give Chicago a break because they had done nothing, and their Congressman Lipinski was on the board of the Transit Authority as well in Chicago. He pushed hard and got his buddies to give him 10 more years. Amtrak was supposed to be accessible in 2010. Didn't happen. Most of their stations are accessible in the Northeast Corridor, so you wouldn't know it, but most of the country is not at this point. So I know we're running out of time, so I will stop here. I will tell you one thing though. I was involved in the push to get ADA. All my life, I knew what a discriminatory practice was, whether I could articulate it or not, from my teenage years on, when it came to disability. It was incredible to me to see how unsophisticated and other than knowledgeable congressmen, elected officials themselves, and their staffs were about people with disabilities. They'd been sheltered, and even if they knew a person with a disability, that was their guy with a disability. They didn't think that person stood for anything. Yeah, that guy's a super achiever, but the latent potential of people with disabilities was ignored. The only thing that wasn't was the disability benefits they were collecting and the Medicaid they were collecting, and people on the left and the right easily could agree that everybody who can work should. And I mean, Jesse Helms waved the ADA, the New York Times over his head and said this liberal paper opposes, even this liberal New York paper opposes ADA, which is true. So it was hardly universally accepted if the New York Times and Jesse Helms are on the same side. But here we are 30 years later, which I guess we'll get to talk about, but here we are 30 years later, there's lots done and lots not done. I'll stop there.
That's actually a great transition to Kevin, because I think we would ask Kevin to speak to activism in this millennia and the fulfilled and unfulfilled promise of the ADA.
Thank you. And thank you all for having me. I'm going to try to keep honest with my time, so I'll glance over at my watch from time to time. But before I do that, Craig, before I guess I take us into the new millennium, I did want to reflect on these two great stories. By that, I mean talks that we just heard. Mark gave us kind of this pre-Rehabilitation Act narrative and what was going on prior to 1973. And we hear these stories of discrimination. And I think we're living at a time, and I'll get to this probably the second question and so forth, when we're going to be talking about intersectionality, people who are oppressed. In my discipline, as a lawyer, we refer to the word as subordination. That's kind of a fancy word for oppression. What does it mean to be oppressed? And I'm not going to put words into Mark's mouth. Mark can articulate it himself, but what I see are three ingredients. And I don't tend to like really complicated theories. I like them to be easy because then we can apply them across the board. Here's a theory of oppression that might be consistent with what you're studying in school or maybe not, but what I'm going to suggest is that we can apply it across the board, and I think some of Mark's stories fit in. Three ingredients. One is prejudice, what we might say bias or animus. We might call it hate. Another is stereotypes. This can be unconscious or conscious, but it's these generalizations we make about people. They can't do that. They shouldn't be doing that. They might hurt themselves if they do that. And the last one, and I think the hardest one for people to swallow, as Jim just alluded to, the New York Times couldn't even swallow this. The last one is neglect, societal neglect. It's not that we hate these people. It's not that we stereotype or generalize them as dangerous to others, to themselves, and so forth. We just don't think about them at all. Think about the number of steps that lead up to the US Capitol. Think of our money US dollars indistinguishable to a person with a visual impairment. Now, I alluded to the fact that we can apply this theory. So when people experience these three things, and they experience them consistently, all the time, that, I think, is what it means to be oppressed. People with disabilities, as Mark and Jim just ran through, are and were. We can also apply this to the racial justice sphere. We can apply this to LGBT. We can apply this to other communities, undocumented and so forth, and I'll probably do that a little bit later. Folks who are oppressed experience these things. So in the disability context, as Mark was telling us, people were experiencing this. Think of the discrimination that Mark talked about. It was coming at the highest levels. It was coming from government, elementary schools that would not admit Mark, secondary schools that weren't, and colleges that weren't accessible, physically accessible. So that neglect that we saw. We also saw it in the private sphere, the movie house that said that Mark was a fire hazard. And Mark, you can tell me this later, but I remember reading that in the legislative history of the ADA. I wonder if that was your story, or if this was something that was so ubiquitous, it happened all the time. But I remember reading that story and it took my breath away. That story, and one we can get to, it's an awful story. A young person with, I believe at the time they would have called it, I guess this was Down syndrome. There was also some intellectual disabilities, but a young child with Down syndrome who was not allowed into a zoo. The zookeeper said that the child might upset the chimpanzees. Okay, so this is in the legislative history of the ADA, these kind of stories. I'm highlighting this, one, because we got Mark right here who's giving it to us, but also because this tells us how culture, how stories push law. And I'm a lawyer by trade, a lot of times we're a lot slower. We don't push culture, culture pushes us. And that's where Jim comes in. And I think in Jim's second sentence, he said, we sued. Okay, so the power of law, what do? Well, you got lawyers out there who are, hopefully they got good hearts and they want to get paid. Okay, they're gonna sue. They're gonna bring cases. Jim was doing a lot of this. So after passage of the Rehabilitation Act, he's out there suing, and then certainly after the ADA provided the tools for people to be able to enforce these rights. I will say that the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was limited because it only applied to entities that were federally funded. Bottom line, yes, it likely applied to those schools that excluded Mark, but it didn't apply to that movie house. That movie house could go right on saying that people like you can't come in here because you're a danger. Same thing with hotels. Same thing with restaurants, and so on and so forth. Private businesses were not impacted. Neither were private employers. Company X could go on, so they schedule the interview, person comes in using a wheelchair, person comes in maybe on the autism spectrum, not making eye contact. Oh, this person's not getting the job. Just like that. They were not covered. That's what the ADA begins to give us. Jim touched on this, though. The remarkable thing about the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA, though, was that they provided this duty of reasonable accommodation. So many folks on the Zoom call might be aware of that, but that was a radical notion, and I suspect that's what the New York Times disliked most about the ADA. It said, in order to not discriminate, in order to not oppress people, it's not enough to just say, we don't hate them, we don't stereotype them. It actually required private businesses, governments to do something affirmative. You heard me right, affirmative action for people with disabilities, ramps like Jim described, and other things, making our technology accessible and so forth. That was radical, and it still is. And so we'll examine some of that kind of as we look to the future. All right, so I'm now way past time. Let me make quick work of kind of where I enter into the process. I'll do this in about 3 minutes, I promise. I was born in 1975. 1990, when the ADA was passed, I didn't know. I didn't pay much attention to this. I was listening to some of the best rap music that has ever been made. Yes, I just said that to the next generation. There's some good stuff out there, but that was the golden era. Okay, so went on to college. I was very much into racial justice. I didn't think much about disability justice. It just wasn't on my radar. I wasn't taking courses like you all are. I wasn't taking courses in racial justice that made the connections to disability justice. I didn't. So I had a lot of learning to do. My first lesson came when I was clerking in Portland, Maine for a federal judge. I had a case involving a person who was alleging employment discrimination. This person wanted to work from home. They wanted to telecommute to work. Can you imagine telecommuting to work? No, right? Impossible. And that's what the court ended up saying. No, what? You can't. You need to be watched by an employer or something like that. Anyway, in my conversations with my co-clerk, I walked in, I said, I've got an ADA case. And he didn't even turn around. This is a guy about my age at the time. He would have been mid-20s. He said, the plaintiff loses. And I walked out. He was, he said it in jest, but what he was saying, what he was identifying was the issue that I would spend 2 years of my life working on with the ADA Amendments Act. Mark described the discrimination people with disabilities face. Jim described the laws that we passed and how we enforce them, we sue. But what I was seeing on the front lines, the judges who decide these cases, the law was being warped, was being narrowed by none other than the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court. They did it in 4 decisions, a trio, and then another one. The second case that narrowed the ADA was argued by our Chief Justice, who's done some good things recently, but that was not one of them. Essentially what they did is they took this definition of disability in the ADA. And by the way, I'm sure many of you spend days or weeks trying to define disability. It's very difficult. It matters in law what the law is seeking to do. Is it seeking to provide cash benefits like Jim alluded to? Or is it seeking to provide a removal of oppression, removal of barriers to access? Well, in the ADA, it's all about the latter. And yet the Supreme Court viewed that word disability as if it were a government benefits law. And it essentially said that in order to be protected by the ADA, you have to be very, very, very limited, such that you basically cannot work. You basically cannot enter a building. So I can give you the quick little list, and I don't give this to you to be hyperbolic. I give this to you because this is what Senator Harkin, who was one of the sponsors of the ADA Amendments Act, read on the Senate floor. Here's a quick list of impairments, medical conditions that courts considered as not disabilities. People with these conditions all lost their cases. In lawyer speak, their cases were dismissed. People with prosthetic limbs, people with epilepsy, cancer, cerebral palsy, diabetes, intellectual disabilities, bipolar disorder, multiple sclerosis, hard of hearing, vision in only one eye, post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, heart disease, depression, HIV infection, and asthma. All of these conditions were ruled by courts to be not disabilities, and therefore the plaintiffs who were fired or not hired or otherwise discriminated against based on those impairments were kicked out of court. The ADA was not working. So where I entered in, and I suppose where I'll leave it, was I went down to Georgetown Law after I finished my clerkship and worked with a group of lawyers there who were seeking to amend the ADA. To do what? I think it was Jim or it might have been Mark who alluded to, there's lots of things that we need to change about the ADA. But what this group did is they narrowed it down. They said, what is our biggest problem with the ADA right now? Is it that provision about direct threat? Is it the provision about reasonable accommodation? No, it's about the definition of disability. This definition should have been broad, and the US Supreme Court read it narrowly so that only the most limited are protected by this terrific civil rights law. So thereon, after that, it was 2 years. We worked alongside, negotiated with the business community. And if folks have questions about this, like why the business community and so forth, I'm happy to address that in a bit. But over a series of 2 years, it was negotiators, but really it wasn't the negotiators. We were just the people at the table. We were taking our cues from the disability rights community. The business community was taking their cues from the business community. We hammered out language and worked with the staff in Congress it will be no surprise to you, it broke down along Democratic and Republican lines. Disability groups worked with the Democrats, business community worked with the Republicans, but it was a bipartisan piece of legislation, the ADA Amendments Act of 2008, signed into law by George W. Bush. The ADA was signed into law by his father. It meant a lot to him. And I say this at a time when our politics is very polarized. Disability, I think, what I see, and I think Jim might have alluded to this, brings people together, brings parties together. Not everyone in those parties. We've seen awful things come out of the mouth of our current president. But nevertheless, it was a bipartisan piece of legislation. And I think where I can leave it is it's doing pretty well. Mark and Jim can correct me, and I promise you won't hurt my feelings, but I give it a B+, A-. Some courts are still screwing it up, but for the most part, this definition of disability is no longer a hurdle to plaintiffs who are bringing their discrimination cases. That doesn't mean they all win. They may lose for other reasons, but at least most are not losing for this reason. When we get to it, I'm going to tell you about one very troublesome exclusion that's still in this ADA, and I'll seek your opinions on whether we ought to be taking it out, but I'll leave it there for now.
Awesome. Remind me next time to not have two attorneys on the same panel. That was so great. That was such a great look into history and even to the current time. And you'll be surprised to know we only have about 10 minutes left. And we purposefully only asked 3 questions of our panelists, and we've gotten through 1. However, I think I'm going to combine the last 2 questions and make sure that each person is kind of limited to only about 2-3 minutes on this. So the idea, we've gone from disability rights, now there's this idea of disability justice. And as Kevin was talking about, this idea of intersectionality, that we can no longer think only about people with disabilities or disabled people, that individuals also are people of color, immigrants, trans and gender nonconforming, people who are homeless and incarcerated. There's more compounding issues. So describe the effect about making disability activism more inclusive. We think about Black Lives Matter, we think about LGBTQ pride, and there's some great people if we look at, Black Disabled Lives Matter as a movement. If we look at a lot of the activists on Instagram, for those of you that are in that era, or even Facebook, or on my shelf, Judy Human's book, people who are making a difference. So if you can kind of give your closing thoughts of how do we make this more inclusive and give it more power, and also who should we be following? So everyone's got about 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes. You want to start out, Mark?
Okay, first of all, I think the whole issue revolves around both freedom and opportunity. And if you don't have opportunity, you can't get the freedom. And the opportunity for education, the opportunity for employment, the opportunity to own a house, the opportunity to compete with other employees in your job for promotions, all that is a learned experience, and it all requires teaching from a very young age. The experience I had with the Long Island Lightning was an effort on my part, the junior wheelchair basketball team. We had kids between age 5 and high school graduation. My effort was solely concentrated, not so much on basketball, but on teaching these kids that they're just as good as other people. They need to learn how to compete. They need to learn how to win and lose gracefully. And they need to try hard, because if you try hard, you'll succeed. I have to say that by providing that opportunity, we had like 11 kids who got college scholarship money from that program as a result of participating in that program. And that was, it was great to see that happen, and for those kids to mature, and hopefully some of them will remember the opportunity they got and try hard in their lives to provide it for others as well. I used to teach the kids a simple thing about life in general, and that is that if you aspire to perfection, you will achieve near perfection. But if you aspire to mediocrity, you will surely attain it.
Awesome, awesome. Jim, what are your thoughts on inclusivity, activists we should know about, and your closing thoughts?
Well, the next generation of leader is the most important one, except for the generation after them. So I think the first thing we have to do as a disability rights movement is acknowledge that and foster young leadership and keep them involved. You know, we're trying to make people with disabilities assimilate at the exact same time as we want them to be leaders of the disability rights movement. These are almost goals that pull against each other. How can you be president of IBM and a leader in the disability rights movement? How can you aspire to be president of IBM and a leader in the disability rights movement? But of course you can. Of course you. That's the first thing. Is assimilation doesn't mean you're not an activist. You can't be an activist. You have to get other, maybe your friends on board with you that you're assimilated with. Maybe that's part of your activism. But the second thing is, and we have to acknowledge that our rights movement has been missing people, not by design, but racial minorities, people with, actually in the act itself, gender identity disorders are described as not a disability. But, the gay community, the LGBTQ community, we haven't really reached out to them. There's geographically isolated disabled people. There's tribal, indigenous disabled. We just are not, we've missed all these people. Now, the other thing is that the rights movements, the traditional rights movements, the women's movement and the Black movement, after which the disability rights movement is modeled, or, if you think about it, the 70s, you had Vietnam disabled veterans returning home. They were able-bodied into young adulthood. They weren't ready to stay home and watch TV, and they grew up in a time of activism for civil rights for Black people and somewhat for women. They were aware of that community. There was an allegiance that developed between the disabled veteran community and the disabled community to get the Rehab Act passed, to get the ADA passed. But it kind of stopped there. It didn't say who else are we missing or who's not included. And we're doing that now. I had a meeting, Wade Henderson used to run the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And he said to us at a meeting once, he let us use his boardroom, a group of disabled organizations. He let us use his meeting room, and he welcomed us. It was a Saturday morning. And he came in just to say hi, and I think they brought coffee and donuts or something. And he said, hey, look around. You wonder why you're not including Black people? Look who runs your organizations. And we looked around the table, and every single person at the table was white. And he left. And somebody said when he left the room, we should have said to him, how many disabled people are at your board meeting? Right? But we didn't. It would have really been an eye-opener. Now there are disabled people at the Leadership Conference board meetings, by the way, only a couple of short years later. So I think that sensitivity to this and awareness of this problem is a step. Just awareness is a step. But then the next step is the outreach. You have to get people in minority communities to identify with the disability community and the rights movements from minority communities to identify with the disability rights movement, which means partnering, supporting their efforts, having them support ours. Not everybody's right all the time, and you don't have to agree with everybody all the time in other rights movements. It's like the difference between a Black Lives Matter protest and a riot. If you meld them all together in your head, then you're going to condemn Black Lives Matter's movement. But if you are intellectual enough to distinguish rioting from demonstrating, which doesn't take a lot, although it seems like a lot of people are missing it, if you're intellectual enough to do that, if you can make that distinction, you can also reach out to rights movements that, like the gay rights movement and civil rights and women movement, and get included in their movements, to say nothing of the labor movement. And I'll stop there.
Awesome. And we're gonna pitch it to Kevin to wrap us up.
Sure. Just a fun story. I guess for the part about who I look to for disability rights activism, I want to pick up on what Jim said. I look to all of these folks on the phone. I really do look to the future. I too share that kind of, sorrow in that when I was negotiating, I was a team of negotiators. This was 2008. We recently had we met again. The negotiators met just about a year ago. And one of them commented on how white we all were. And that's, of course, true. I don't think any of us felt particularly good about it at the time, but I feel a lot worse about it now. And I don't want to see that continue. I don't think it will. I think that's what disability justice gives us. It's putting kind of nothing about us without us. And disability issues, like others, include everybody. So I think that will be a thing of the past that we are affirmatively changing, which is good. What I will say, let me drop back to the past, 1978, San Francisco. Jim talked about the passage of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. That act didn't really get legs, though, until 1978 with the passage of the regulations. And it was a big push by the disability community. But there's this great story in San Francisco where you've got this disability rights organization that's doing a sit-in to try to push for these regs. And you know who was bringing them food and walkie-talkies was the Black Panther Party and the Butterfly Brigade. And maybe you don't need me to tell you this, but the Butterfly Brigade was an LGBT rights organization. So back then, I mean, they wrote the script. I mean, we had these groups, robust intersectional support for disability rights. And we still can, and we need to. I myself have been involved in some great conversations and in-person meetings. Jim, you'd be happy to hear this, but around issues of providing protection for gender dysphoria. Trans people who are experiencing discrimination based on a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, not gender identity disorder. That was an old diagnosis that basically said trans people are disordered. No, this is gender dysphoria. It's people who experience distress or who would if they don't transition. Where this is really coming to bear is in prison, where prisoners don't have other kinds of statutes to help, but they've got the ADA because those prisons accept, they're government services. As we know, in our prison population, disproportionate numbers of people are people of color. So this is the intersection. This is Black, brown, trans people who are not getting the access to healthcare that they should. The ADA, I can say, is helping. It is. And so we've had meetings with disability organizations, mental health organizations, and trans rights organizations, the national groups. I'm also interested in what the neurodiversity community has been doing around issues of intersectionality as well. So these are conversations that we're having. And I think the people on this call, if you want to be, there's plenty of room for you. And these movements need you. And these groups are talking. They are not islands. Not many of them, at least. So I think with that, I could just touch on a couple of my quick little goals. I think Craig touched on some of them, but in the future, and Mark and Jim probably have their own wish list, but here it is. In employment, might we see, given everything that's happened with COVID, facilitating the ability of workers with disabilities to work from home? In education, can we dismantle the school to prison pipeline for students with disabilities in elementary, secondary school? They are especially hard hit. Can we make these university websites accessible? It'll be no surprise to you, the Trump administration put the brakes on that. Will this next administration do so? And then in government services, can we improve police interactions with people with disabilities? When we talk about Black Lives Matter, of course they do. And in particular, and I think someone mentioned it, Black people with disabilities. These are the folks who are particularly hard hit, who disability law can be helping, and right now ought to be doing more. So that's just some of the items on my wish list, but I'll leave it there. Thank you, Andrea.
Awesome. And we thank you all so much for this, and so many points that all three of you, and especially in your closing thoughts, Kevin, that I think that many of these issues are going to continue to be discussed in conversation through the Center, for Race, Culture, and Social Justice here at Hofstra. I know that Jonathan had mentioned that the Prison to Pipeline is coming up in a co-sponsored event with CCE, so we hope to invite you in to continue these conversations and consider.
Next Wednesday.
Yep,
Next
consider
Wednesday,
those movements.
Same bad time, same bad channel.
So I'll toss it to Veronica and Jonathan to close the session if you have any parting thoughts from the center.
Yes, these were great panelists. Thank you so much, Andrea and Craig. I was taking notes, and I'm really impressed with all of the stories and the analyses of what's going on, particularly at the intersections of race, culture, and social justice. You really, make our name, stand out, and the things that we try to do to make these critical connections between all the communities that suffer from neglect and oppression, public and private and so forth. So, and the whole idea about culture pushing society, as opposed to the other way around, I thought was a very poignant remark. So keep up the good work. I appreciate it. Thank you. Veronica?
No, I just want to thank you all for.
We lost you, Veronica. You have to unmute.
So much. Thank you all
There
so
you
much
go.
for coming today. We really appreciate this fruitful discussion. I think we might need to do this again next semester. We wish you well, and thank you. Thanks.
Now that we're sufficiently teased, we need a conference or workshop.
Conversation
really,
on disability justice.
Yes,
I'm ready.
right, exactly. So,
Awesome.
yeah, thank you so much. So keep up with us. Check out our events on the website, raceculturesocialjustice.com. That's where we are, or .edu actually.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you
Have a
so
good day.
much.
Appreciate it.